Welcome back, everybody. Today we're revisiting a case that sent shockwaves through the world of pro wrestling and really got people talking about the dangers of a sport that a lot of us grew up watching.
Yeah, it's one of those cases that goes way beyond just the ring.
Yeah,
It brings up some serious questions about what happens when you get hit in the head over and over again, something we see in a lot of contact sports.
exactly. And we're diving into the tragic story of Chris Benoit, a wrestler who was at the top of his game and then ended his life in a really shocking murder-suicide back in 2007. We're going to be using a 2016 episode of the podcast My Favorite Murder, along with their 2023 Rewind episode, where they went back and looked at the case with some fresh perspective to kind of guide our deep dive today.
Tough story, no doubt, but it's a story that has a lot to teach us about the struggles that athletes often face behind the scenes and the price that sometimes gets paid for the entertainment we enjoy.
So let's start by setting the scene. Who was Chris Benoit before all this tragedy happened? I mean, he was a Canadian wrestler who dedicated over 20 years of his life to this sport. A true veteran with like 22 championship titles.
He wasn't just any champion, though. He
Mm.
was known for his crazy technical skills, his intensity in the ring, and this quiet, almost shy personality when he wasn't wrestling. Peers and fans loved the guy.
But some of his signature moves, they paint a different picture, a picture of just brutality. I mean, we're talking about the diving headbutt straight from the top rope
Yeah.
and a crippler crossface, a submission hold that went right for the head and neck.
Yeah, those moves got the crowd going wild, but the damage he was doing to himself, those constant impacts to his head and neck, that was a major red flag even back then.
And then we get to June 25th, 2007. The scene, Benoit's mansion in Fayetteville, Georgia. This place was heavily fortified, gated property, German shepherds patrolling. I mean, it wasn't your typical home.
It definitely says something about the life of a high-profile figure. Maybe a little paranoia, maybe a need for that extreme security. Whatever it was, it just adds another layer to this whole disturbing situation.
The police got called out there, but they couldn't get past all the security. They had to get Benoit's neighbor to help them get past the dogs and inside. What they found was absolutely horrific.
A total nightmare. The bodies of Chris, his wife Nancy, and their 7-year-old son Daniel, each one found in a different room, each death more disturbing than the last.
Nancy was found bound signs of physical abuse. A Bible placed right beside her. Daniel had been suffocated in his bedroom, also with a Bible nearby.
And Chris was found hanged in his weight room. Evidence suggests he actually tried to make it as painful as possible. It just adds another layer of unsettling complexity to this whole thing.
The big question on everyone's mind was, why? Steroids were an early theory because there was evidence that both Chris and Nancy were using them.
And on top of that, there were rumors about problems in their marriage, maybe infidelity, and of course the crazy pressure of Benoit's wrestling career. It seemed like this perfect storm of personal and professional turmoil.
But then things take a really unexpected turn.
Mm.
The autopsy on Benoit's brain revealed some serious damage. The kind of damage you'd expect to see in an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient.
Mm.
This completely changed the direction of the investigation.
Yeah, this is where the case goes beyond just one man's tragedy and becomes this big warning sign about the dangers that come with certain sports, especially the ones where you're getting hit in the head over and over again.
The focus shifted to chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. This brain disease we know now is caused by repeated concussions. It can lead to dementia, personality changes, aggression, and really bad decision-making.
Knowing what we know now about CTE, you can't ignore the link between the head trauma Benoit went through and the things he did that weekend.
It's hard to imagine the kind of mental decline he must have been experiencing. All those diving headbutts, chair shots, the impact of those signature moves, it all paints a terrifying picture of cumulative brain damage.
And this is where the case gets really complicated. It's not just about finding a simple motive. We have to ask, what role did CTE play in all of this? Was it the only cause? Probably not. But the evidence points to it being a major factor in Benoit's state of mind.
This case really had a huge impact on pro wrestling, didn't it? Like, it forced everyone to look at the brutal reality of the sport and the risks these wrestlers were taking.
Oh, absolutely. It was a wake-up call, for sure. And it made them rethink safety in a big way. The WWE, they actually implemented stricter rules about headshots and even banned some moves like Benoit's diving headbutt.
Yeah, a move that was like his trademark, suddenly considered too dangerous.
Yeah.
It really shows how much things changed after this happened.
And the conversation went beyond just wrestling. It became relevant to any sport where you're at risk for repeated head trauma, football, hockey, soccer, the list goes on. And we're finally starting to see people understand the long-term effects of these injuries. Organizations are being held accountable for the safety of their athletes.
So let's talk about the My Favorite Murder podcast for a second. It might seem like a strange place to discuss such a serious topic.
Right, but what's interesting about their approach is how they mix empathy with this kind of dark humor. It's a way that a lot of people deal with tough and disturbing stuff. It's not about making light of the tragedy, but finding a way to process something dark.
Yeah, and their own experiences with fear and true crime make them relatable.
Yeah.
They're not just lecturing, they're sharing their own journey as they try to wrap their heads around these difficult topics.
It shows how storytelling can make true crime something that everyone can connect with and understand. They might not be experts, but they get people talking about important things.
One thing that really stuck with me from the podcast was when they talked about Benoit's mental state before the murders. He apparently called some of his colleagues and said that his wife and son were sick with food poisoning.
That's a chilling detail for sure. It suggests that he might have planned this out, but it also makes you wonder if it was his way of distancing himself from what he was about to do. Like a part of him knew this wasn't the real Chris Benoit.
They also mentioned how his behavior in the days before was off.
Yeah.
Strange texts, missed appointments, paranoia, all the classic signs of someone in a serious mental health crisis.
It really highlights how important it is to pay attention to those warning signs and get help, both for ourselves and for the people we care about. We need to be able to talk openly about mental health, especially in high-pressure jobs like pro wrestling.
They talked about the media frenzy around the case, too, how the Benoit family tragedy became this global headline with everyone trying to understand this unthinkable act.
Yeah, it's a reminder of how these stories can get blown out of proportion and the focus shifts away from the victims to the person who committed the crime. It's so important to remember the human cost of these tragedies, the people who suffered this unimaginable loss.
And to their credit, the podcast hosts talk about how uncomfortable they were with the way Benoit was initially portrayed as a monster.
Oh.
They acknowledged how horrific his actions were, but also emphasized the complexity of it all, suggesting that CTE probably played a big role in his mental decline. It's a much more nuanced view, holding him accountable while recognizing the impact of mental illness. It reminds us that sometimes actions don't tell the whole story, especially when something like CTE is involved.
Exactly. And they brought up the whole steroid issue too. Both Chris and Nancy were reportedly using steroids, and the hosts talked about how that could have made things worse, like increased aggression and impulsivity.
It's a big problem in pro sports, and we need to understand the potential side effects, both physical and mental. It's not just about getting an edge, it's about the long-term health of the athletes.
It's a tough balance finding that sweet spot between entertainment and safety. I mean, fans love the excitement, the drama, but there has to be a line somewhere, a responsibility to protect these performers.
So let's move on to the Rewind episode, where they went back and looked at the case again with years of hindsight and a better understanding of CTE.
Yeah, it showed that they were willing to adapt their views based on new information. And it reflects how our understanding of CTE has evolved too. What we knew back in 2016 is different from what we know now.
They talked about the progress in research, the increased awareness, and the changes made in wrestling.
It's a good sign, you know? It shows that the conversation didn't end with the initial shock of the tragedy. We're actually making progress in understanding and dealing with CTE.
And they brought up other contact sports, too, like football. We're seeing more and more former athletes diagnosed with CTE. It's raising concerns about the long-term consequences of all those hits to the head.
It's not a matter of if anymore, it's a matter of how we deal with it. We have to prioritize research, prevention, and support for those who are affected.
The Rewind episode also talked about Benoit's complicated legacy. Many fans still struggle with the fact that the wrestler they admired did these horrific things.
It's a reminder that people are complex. We're all capable of good and bad, and sometimes things happen that push us to extremes we never thought possible.
The hosts reflected on how the case affected them personally and how they view true crime. They talked about how emotionally draining it can be to deal with such heavy subject matter, but also how important it is to raise awareness and advocate for change.
It's a powerful message. True crime can be tough to handle, but it can also make us more empathetic, understanding, and proactive. These stories can teach us, help us grow, and make a positive difference in the world.
So let's recap. We've looked at Chris Benoit's life and career, the tragic events that led to his death and the deaths of his wife and son, and the possible role of CTE in all of this. We've also explored how the My Favorite Murder podcast tackled this complex case, highlighting how powerful storytelling and open discussions can be.
What's really striking is how this case makes us think about how complicated human behavior can be. It's easy to call Benoit a monster, but it's much more nuanced than that. We have to consider the impact of brain trauma, mental health struggles, and the culture surrounding these high-impact sports.
It also reminds us that we never really know what someone is going through.
Yeah.
You might see success and happiness on the outside, but there could be hidden pain and struggles underneath.
And that brings up a crucial question. What can we do to prevent something like this from happening again? How can we create a culture that prioritizes mental health, recognizes the signs of brain trauma, and supports athletes who might be struggling?
Those are questions we'll dig into as we continue our deep dive into the Chris Benoit tragedy. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time talking about this really dark tragedy, but I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about solutions. Like, what can we actually do to try to prevent something like this from happening again?
Well, it starts with education and awareness, you
Right.
know? We got to teach everyone, athletes, coaches, parents, everyone involved about the risks of concussions and what can happen when you get hit in the head too many times. There's still so many people who don't understand CTE or think it's not a big deal, and that's got to change.
Right. It's not just about wearing a helmet or avoiding certain moves. It's about knowing how to spot even a mild concussion and taking it seriously.
Absolutely. And we need athletes to feel like they can speak up about their symptoms without worrying about losing their spot. We have to get rid of that tough it out mentality that's so common in these sports.
The Rewind episode really emphasized how important it is for organizations to create a supportive environment where athletes put their long-term health first.
Yeah, it's about changing the whole mindset from winning at all costs to winning the right way, protecting these athletes instead of taking advantage of their passion.
We also need to keep improving safety protocols. I mean, we've seen some positive changes lately, like stricter rules in wrestling and football,
Right.
but there's always more we can do.
For sure. We got to keep researching ways to prevent concussions, develop better equipment, and figure out how to diagnose and treat CTE more effectively. The science is always evolving, so we need to stay on top of it.
And it's not just the physical impact. We need to pay attention to the mental and emotional stress these athletes are under too.
You're right. Athletes in these high-impact sports are under so much pressure to perform. They might not want to ask for help when they're struggling mentally. So we need to make it easier for them to talk about these things and give them the support they need.
Like that peer support network for wrestlers we mentioned earlier. Programs like that are so important. It gives them a safe space to connect with other people who get it.
Exactly. It's about building a sense of community and shared understanding. That can be so powerful. Just knowing you're not alone can make a huge difference.
This deep dive has been a real emotional journey. We've gone into some really dark places and explored the complexities of the human mind. But we've also seen some hopeful signs and a growing awareness of these important issues.
The Benoit case, as terrible as it was, has really forced us to have these conversations about CTE athlete safety and the responsibility we all have to protect these people.
So as we wrap things up, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from this?
I think it's this. Behind all the entertainment, behind the spectacle, are real human beings who are putting their bodies and minds on the line. Let's honor their dedication by fighting for their well-being and working towards a future where athletes can thrive both in their sport and in their lives.
Well said. And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep learning about this. Research organizations that are working to raise awareness about CTE. Learn about the stories of other athletes who've been affected by this. The more we know, the better equipped we are to create a safer, more compassionate environment for these amazing individuals.
Let's not let this tragedy be for nothing. Let's use Chris Benoit's story as a turning point, a chance to create real change in the world of sports.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It was the tough one, but these are the conversations we need to have. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay compassionate.